When it comes to the social and political climate in America that set the stage for the Civil War, we need look no further than the Old Courthouse in downtown St. Louis. A slave named Dred Scott went to court here and sued for his freedom. Eventually he got it, but not because our justice system decided in his favor.
How long have you been here? You're new to this job, aren't you?
I'm new, yeah, 21 years.
Bob, we are standing drop dead center under the peak of the dome on top of the Old Courthouse. Of what significance is this building as far as St. Louis Civil War locations is concerned?
Well, for the Civil War, the building's extremely significant because this was the site of the Dred Scott case, which was heard first here in 1847, 1850, and then eventually went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was that Supreme Court decision in 1857 that was one of the flashpoints of the Civil War.
Right. A freedom case, right?
That's right, yeah. We know that there were a lot of slaves in St. Louis who sued for their freedom. In fact, over 300 other slaves other than Dred Scott. But Dred and his wife Harriet sued for their freedom. And it was kind of a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they got caught up in the legal system in a way that led to this Supreme Court decision. A little over half of the cases were decided for the slave, and the slave would be set free. So that was what the Scotts were angling for. Dred and his wife Harriet were slaves who lived here in St. Louis, but they had been taken, yes, they've been taken to different areas of the country by their owner, who was a surgeon with the U.S. Army. And so he took them to, he took Dred to one post that was in Illinois, and Dred and Harriet were both at a post in Fort Snelling, which today's in Minnesota, was then in the territory of Wisconsin. So both of those places really qualified them to sue for their freedom when they were brought back to St. Louis.
Because they had been in a free state.
Actually had been brought by their owner and kind of forced to live in an area that was not supposed to allow slavery.
Now, was that kind of a calculated risk on the part of his owner? Did he know, should he have known in crossing over into free territory?
He probably could have found that out because there was a famous case that actually was also launched in this building, a woman named Rachel who sued her owner for her freedom in 1836, and she had been taken to these same two exact places by her owner who was in the military, and she won her freedom. Her case also went to the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, and they confirmed that she should be a free person. So that was 10 years before Emerson was doing what he was doing, and he could easily have found out that he was at risk of having his slaves taken away from him.
Now, Bob, as far as this being kind of a precursor to the Civil War, it was just sort of an example of the environment in the country, is that right, which led up to war?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that was the determining factor in this leading to the Civil War was that people were worried, people who were slave owners or people who felt that the slave system was not a bad thing, that the federal government was going to come down on them and say, slavery is wrong, we're going to outlaw it, you no longer can own your slaves. So that was a huge fear. And then on the other side, in the northern states and territories, people were afraid that the federal government, and especially the Supreme Court, was going to make decisions that was going to say, you can't restrict slavery because slaves are property. So you can't say that if people take their property from a place where it's legal to own it into a place where you're saying it isn't legal, that it can be taken away from them. So both sides were really worried about this issue. So along comes Dred Scott's case, which kind of feeds the fears of both sides.
Right.
And when the Supreme Court actually makes a decision, takes sides in the case, and says, first of all, that Dred Scott can't sue in federal courts because no person of color can be considered to be a citizen and have no rights which white men are bound to respect, which is an actual lift quote out of the decision. And it says that slavery can no longer be restricted in the Western territories. You can't restrict slavery out there. If people want to have slaves, they can have slaves. Abraham Lincoln comes along next year, runs for a Senate seat in Illinois against Stephen Douglas, and during the course of their famous debates, constantly harkens back to the Dred Scott decision. And Lincoln's point is, the Supreme Court's next decision, the next case they decide after Dred Scott on this same issue, they're going to say that states can no longer limit slavery within their borders.
Well, Bob, some of the Dred Scott proceedings happened right here in what was then a courtroom on the western side of the first floor of the old courthouse.
That's right.
It was 1850 there?
Right, this picture was taken in about 1851, so that's the way the building actually would have looked when Dred Scott came in for his second trial. By the time the trial took place, Dr. Emerson had passed away, and ownership of the slaves had passed to his wife.
Mrs. Emerson remarried to a Massachusetts doctor who was elected to Congress on an abolitionist platform. She then transferred ownership of her slaves to her brother, who died shortly thereafter.
Ownership of the slaves reverted to Mrs. Emerson Chaffee. So suddenly, Dr. Chaffee finds himself the owner of the most famous slaves in America. And we have copies here in our exhibit of some of the fevered letters that he writes to several people to say, how can I unload these slaves quickly before the press finds out?
Yeah, because he ran on an abolitionist platform?
Absolutely. So he was a Republican member of Congress, and he owns Dred and Harriet Scott.
Right, but by default.
Right,
Yeah.
but how do you explain that, right?
Right.
So at any rate, they worked out a strategy by which the Chaffees sold the Scotts for a token dollar to the Blow family, who still lived here in St. Louis and were the original owners of the Scotts. And then they brought them into this building and set them free.
Right. And that's how the Scotts gained their freedom,
That's how the Scotts gained their freedom.
because Taylor Blow gave it to them.
Right. The power of the press and the political situation with Chaffee is the thing that really pushed them to be enabled to get their freedom.
So Taylor Blow had to come back to this same building in order
Right.
for the Scots to get their freedom, the building where they
Right.
had initially lost that case, right?
Right. Well, and one thing that we like to point out, and I think this exhibit kind of points that up, the Scots were St. Louisans, and I think a lot of people lose sight of that. They had come and settled here, and their descendants still live here. And so, you know, the idea that the Scots are members of this community and were members of this community. So they lived here. This is where they sued for their freedom, and of course, this is where they would have gained their freedom because this was the courthouse for their community.